So this is about a 35 to 40-minute talk, right?
You can take your time, 45 to 1 hour, as you wish. Professor, shall we start now?
Please. Yeah.
Good morning, all. Welcome to 8th talk conducted by SAMEEKSHA webinar series, organized by AKRSA, KFRI. Today we have Professor Mahesh Sankaran, NCBS. He is talking on the past, present, and the future of tropical grassy biomes. He got his PhD from Syracuse University, New York, and then postdoc in Center for Population Biology, Imperial College, London. He worked as a research scientist in Natural Science Ecology Laboratory, Colorado State University. And he has so many experience in working with savanna, grasslands, and tropical rainforest ecosystems. And his major study area, or the questions he has answered in his whole research career, includes they are mainly focusing on the savanna ecosystems. For example, how the trees and grass coexist in savanna, and the influence of biotic and abiotic factors on the ecosystem functions and the stability, and the functional differences between a savanna and savanna forest transitions, and some frameworks for its conservation. And he conducting field and greenhouse experiments to understand the response and comparative growth performance of grass and trees, which among them is showing comparative growth performance in a climate change scenario. And is conducting elevation-driven studies in some hilly grassland areas, especially in Eastern Himalaya and some in South India, Kalakad Mundandur Tiger Reserve, etc. And he is monitoring or studying the herbivory and nutrient availability based on the elevation of that hilly area. And other one is the impact of human land use for fragmentation, past logging on ecosystem services. In that ecosystem services is focusing on carbon sequestration. This kind of studies are conducting in tropical rainforests. And his team established permanent plots for monitoring trends in vegetation dynamics. So happy to inform you that our scientists in KFRI also establishing some permanent plots in various kind of ecosystems to analyze the trends in vegetation dynamics. And he published several papers, mainly in reputed journals like Nature. He has 4 papers in Nature, others in Science, Biological Conservation, Global Change Biology, Ecology, etc. So I welcome Sir to deliver his presentation. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Sir, one more thing. Please all should off your mics, and only the video should active right now to the participants. And if you have any questions, please write it down in the chat box, and we will hand over the question to Professor. Thanking you.
Yeah, thank you very much for that introduction, for that very kind introduction, actually. Can you see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Like I said, thank you for that introduction, and thank you also for asking me to be a part of this seminar series. And I hope all of you are actually doing well during these rather curious times that we seem to be living in. So like it was said, I'm going to be talking today about tropical grassy biomes, past, present, and future. And before I get started, I would actually like to also acknowledge the contribution of several collaborators, including Dr. Jayashree Ratnam and many of my students, both past and present, on whose work I'll be drawing quite a bit during the course of this talk. So what I thought I'd do for this talk is sort of keep it fairly broad and give you a broad introduction of tropical grassy biomes. And then towards the end, I thought I'll sort of focus in on one specific iconic grassland system in India that we've been studying quite a bit and talk about that in a little bit more detail, right? Right, so let's start off with what are tropical grassy biomes. Now, this term has been sort of used a lot in the last decade or so. And unlike when first people think about or hear the term tropical grassy biomes, one sort of tends to think about grasslands. But tropical grassy biomes, in the sense of the term that as it's used today, doesn't refer just to grasslands, but it includes both grasslands and savanna ecosystems. So systems in which you have grasses playing a very major role. So in both of these photographs on the left, you can see it's primarily grasses without any trees, but on the right-hand side, which is savanna ecosystem, you can actually see, you have scattered trees, but there's a near continuous understory of grasses. And when we talk about tropical grassy biomes, essentially what we mean are systems that are characterized by a C4 grassy understory and a discontinuous strata of woody trees. Now, the woody trees are absent in the grasslands, but they're present to varying degrees in savanna ecosystems. I'm presuming most people are familiar with the C4 photosynthetic pathway. So there are different photosynthetic pathways. There is the C3, which is the more widespread pathway. And in the C3 photosynthesis, the first product is its C3 carbon product, whereas in the C4 photosynthetic pathway, the first product is a C4 carbon. And C4 plants have a CO2 concentrating mechanism, which allows them to do well under low CO2 conditions and under more arid conditions. But the key point here is that C4 grasses and C4 plants and C3 plants have fundamentally different physiologies. And when we talk about tropical grassy biomes in particular, the C4 plants play a very key role in defining the function and the ecology of these systems. So the presence of both C4 and C3 grasses makes these tropical grassy biomes functionally different from forests. When we talk about forests, typically the C4 grasses fall out. You may have some C3 grasses present in forests, but largely it's composed primarily of C3 plants, right? And this distinction is very important because it drives the functional ecology of these systems. So before I get into this in detail, I thought I'd talk a little bit about the history of tropical grassy biomes. Now the C4 photosynthetic pathway evolved multiple times, and it's been present for more than 30 million years. But if we talk about tropical grassy biomes as a whole, they're amongst the most widespread biome in the tropics. So if you look at most of the southern continents, which is like Africa and Australia, they cover more than 50% of the southern continent. And besides, and they're second only to tropical rainforests in the extent of their distribution, right? Another key feature of these tropical grassy biomes is that they support the greatest density and diversity of mammalian herbivores and carnivores of any ecosystem on Earth. So we can think about, the Serengeti ecosystem, which is a classic system that supports, huge populations of mammalian herbivores and carnivores. And even in India, if you look at where most of our herbivore and carnivore diversity is, a lot of it tends to be in tropical grassy biomes, right? And they also support a large fraction of the world's human population. More than a fifth of the world's human population relies on tropical grassy biomes for their sustenance. And most of the rangeland and livestock of the world is concentrated in these tropical grassy biomes. So like I said, the C4 photosynthetic pathway evolved a long time ago. But if you think about tropical grassy biomes as a whole, they're amongst the youngest biomes on Earth, right? And they're believed to have evolved around in the late Miocene, about 5 to 8 million years ago. So even though C4 plants have been present for much longer, for way before 5 to 8 million years ago, something happened around 5 to 8 million years ago, which resulted in the near synchronous expansion of C4 grasses across the globe. So in geological times, over a very short period, C4 grasses just expanded all across the globe and formed all of the tropical grasslands and savannas that we see today. And this is believed to represent one of the most, dramatic values in this -8 to -12 are the C3 plants, and values closer to 0 represent the C4 plants. And these are data taken from, enamel of herbivores and so on. And so from East Africa, from Pakistan, or the Shivaliks in Pakistan, and North America. And in all cases, the x-axis is time. And you can see somewhere between 5 to 8 million years ago, you see the sudden synchronous shift on all 3 continents, in all 3 areas, where you see the switch from C3 to C4, right? Predominance by C4. So somewhere around this time, about 5 to 8 million years ago, is when this expansion of C4 grasses across the globe happened, resulting in the tropical grasslands and savannas that we see across the world today. And the reasons for this are not very clear. I mean, it's debated. People have argued that it was a period of low CO2 that favored C4 expansion. Other people invoke the role of fires and so on. But irrespective of the cause, what we know is that suddenly around this time, the C4 grasses expanded right across the globe, resulting in the grasslands and savannas that we see today, right? So where are these tropical grassy biomes in India? Now, unfortunately, there are very few accurate maps of grasslands and savannas in India. I've just pulled one map here just to compare it to show you the global distribution of TGBs. This is a map from Murphy et al. 2016. But if we focus in on India in general, we find that we have very few accurate maps of grasslands and savannas, and most maps also disagree in terms of their potential distributions, right? Why is that? And it turns out that it is just probably a question of semantics. So if we look at the history of vegetation classification in India, early vegetation classifications were from a forestry and timber operations perspective, right? And so this is one map that I've pulled out of potential vegetation distribution in India of the different vegetation types. And there are many others that you can pull out. And one thing you'll notice here is that if you look at all of these, you rarely see the term savanna itself mentioned, right? So we can see like the things in yellow would be tropical thorn forest, tropical scrub forest, tropical dry deciduous vegetation, and so on, right? And because we approached it from the perspective of forestry traditionally, we tend to call them forests, even though they are not actually forests in the sense that people use the term today. So what are the areas? Where might we expect to find these tropical grassy biomes? So if you look across other continents, typically we see that most of the tropical grassy biomes tend to be found in arid to semi-arid areas, transitioning towards the Mesic. And if we actually figure out where these arid areas, these semi-arid areas are, so this, then we can probably get some idea of the potential distribution of tropical grassy biomes in the country. So this is data from a CGIAR data set where they provide measures of aridity across the country. And here aridity is defined as the ratio of rainfall to potential evapotranspiration, right? And for those of you who are not familiar with it, essentially it's an index that takes both rainfall and temperature into account. So for the same amount of rainfall, in hotter areas, there's going to be less water available for plants. So it's not just the rainfall, but it's a combination of both rainfall and temperature that determines the water stress for plants. So this is the aridity index. If you look at it, the redder areas are the more arid sites, and transitioning into the more mesic sites in blue, right? And this range 0.2 to 0.5 is where we tend to see a lot of the tropical grassy biomes in other countries. So if we look at traditional classifications and see what are the vegetation types that we find approximately in this area, this is what it looks like. So I've extracted these ecoregions from Olson's map of ecoregions of the world. So this is a classification scheme that's used quite a lot, and Olson, it's derived from many other classification systems. So in this case, they draw upon Champion Insect and many other classification systems that have come before. But essentially what I want to point out here is if we look at these areas, so the approximate biomes that are present in these semi-arid areas, essentially we see things like Deccan thorn scrub forests, Kathiawar Gir dry deciduous forests, northern dry deciduous forests, northern thorn scrub forests. So in all cases, they're called forests, but the term savanna itself is rarely found in these classifications, right? So, but if we actually go and look at the vegetation in all of these different types, so I'll just give you a few examples, photos of vegetation in some of these different biomes. So if you look at Western India, in Maharashtra, northern Maharashtra, this is what the vegetation looks like, right? So again, you can see it's a grassy understory with scattered trees. The same thing if you go to southeastern India, this is, again, we can see there's an open grassland on the photo on the left. The photo on the right was taken in NSTR, Nagarjuna Sagar Sri Salem Tiger Reserve. And again, you can see it's a grassy understory with very scattered trees. Most people working in other continents will call this savannas, but if you look at the classification system, this is classified as a dry deciduous forest. Similarly, in southwestern India, so this is from Mudumalai and Bandipur, again, we can see scattered trees and grassy understories. I'm not saying that all of these dry deciduous forests are savannas. I'm just saying that some of the dry deciduous forests do have grassy understories, and these are functionally more like savannas than forests. And we should keep that distinction in mind because it's a very important distinction in terms of how these biomes function, right? And again, in northwestern India, this is the left photos from the Bunny grasslands, and the right is also from Gujarat, and we can see these are grasslands and semi-arid savannas, right? So it seems to be that it's actually just an issue of nomenclature. Many arid to semi-arid savannas, we tend to call them dry thorn forests or scrub forests. Dry to moist savannas, we tend to call them dry deciduous forests or moist deciduous forests. Again, like I said, not all dry deciduous forests are savannas, but some of these savannas have been classified as dry deciduous forests. And very often in many maps, and in terms of the perception of people, grasslands are often considered wastelands, which is a bit of a tragedy. But, right? So why is it important? Why do we really care whether we call them tropical forest or dry thorn forest or a scrub forest or a savanna, right? So why does the land use classification of grasslands as wastelands and savannas as forests matter? It matters because nomenclature can drive management and protection policies in these habitats. It can influence the way we think about these systems and the processes that we think are important in driving the ecology of these systems. And if we misclassify it, then there is a chance that we will actually mismanage it. And in fact, there are examples from the country where this is likely to be happening, right? So again, coming back to this issue of nomenclature, why should we differentiate savannas from forests? And the reason we want to do this is because they have very clear functional differences, right? As I mentioned earlier, it's the C4 grasses that define the ecology of tropical grasslands and savannas. So C4 grass straits drive the functional ecologies of TGBs, whereas their absence is what in many ways defines the ecological attributes of forest environment. So what do I mean by this? So on the left, I have a savanna. You can see it has, herbaceous grassy understory. And on the right, a potential forest where we don't tend to have too many grasses. We don't have grasses in the understory. So now when you have C4 grasses in the understory, the system tends to be highly flammable, right? If you think about, C4 grasses, they're the perfect fuel. So they dry out in the dry season. They have very fine fuels. It's highly aerated. And so it makes for fires, right? So when you have C4 grasses present, the system tends to be highly flammable. And as a result, you tend to have frequent fires. This results in systems that are open and high light environments. And if you look at the traits of the plants themselves, we see that C4 grasses and savanna trees are fire tolerant, but they're shade intolerant. Now the C4 physiology is shade intolerant, and the minute they get shaded out, the C4 grasses drop out of the system. And if we look at the traits of the trees in these savanna systems, what we actually see is that the trees have traits that indicate adaptation to fire. So they have thick barks, they have the ability to resprout following fires, either epicomically or from the basal roots, and they don't tend to die following fires. And essentially, fires are an integral part of these tropical grassy biomes. Whereas if we look at forests, on the other hand, we don't have C4 grasses present, so C4 grasses are absent. Fires tend to be very infrequent, and they're bad for the system typically. It tends to be a closed, low-light environment. And if you look at the traits of the trees or the C3 grasses that can be present there, they tend to be fire intolerant but shade tolerant, right? And so essentially what it means is that in savanna ecosystems, fire is an integral part of the system, whereas if you look at forests, fires are bad. And one of the problems with the misclassification is there seems to be this knee-jerk reaction that fires in all systems in India are bad. So you'll read news articles where people say forests have been gutted by fires. And actually, if you go back within a few months, you'll actually see that mortality levels are actually quite low. The system recovers quite a bit. And in fact, many of these systems have been burning for millions of years, and fire is an integral part of it. And if we stop the fires, that's when the issues, that's when it can lead to all kinds of issues like invasion by exotics, fuel buildup, so that when the fire occurs, it's actually a very intense fire that can actually cause mortality, right? And because of these kind of functional differences, nomenclature is important. That's what we're arguing, because it defines the way you think about the system and how you actually think about managing it, right? So what's the status of tropical grassy biomes in India, right? So large tracts of tropical grassy biomes have already been converted to other uses. So this is a map by Roy et al. Showing the current distribution of current land use patterns across the country. And if you recall from the earlier map, many of these regions are the regions that actually have the potential to support tropical grassy biomes. But we'll see that most of it has already been converted to cropland. And in fact, this has been done a long time ago, because tropical open grasslands and savannas are easy to manipulate. And so they were amongst the first biomes that we modified into croplands. So a large fraction of the area of tropical grassy biomes have already been lost, right? And so we need to be worried quite a bit about the remaining tracts. Couple of other reasons. Many of these TGBs are home to charismatic fauna, like the great Indian bustard. A lot of the antelopes are dry adapted species. A lot of the smaller canids, including hyenas and wolves and so on. But the TGBs don't tend to be protected to the same extent as forests. So if you look at the number of protected areas in the country that are found in these tropical grassy biomes, they're actually very few, and not in proportion to the distribution of these biomes, or also in terms of the fauna that they support, right? I'm sorry. There are several other threats that these TGBs currently face. One is developmental activities to make the land more useful. Many classification systems or perspectives of people is that these are wastelands, and so they need to be, put to good use, right? So there's a lot of agriculture and water harvesting projects that we see in these tropical grassy biomes, including clean energy projects like, wind farms and solar farms and so on. Another major threat that these TGBs are currently facing are tree planting initiatives for carbon sequestration and climate mitigation. So here are a couple of photographs where people have planted trees in these, in these TGBs, and this is not a good idea, right? And there's been tree planting in tropical grassy biomes is in fact a form of degradation and not a form of restoration. We very often think that, if you plant trees, then we are restoring biomes. Well, actually, while this may hold true for forests, it doesn't hold true for tropical grassy biomes. And tree planting in these is a form of degradation. And there have been several high-profile papers that have come out in the last few years talking about why we shouldn't be planting trees in grasslands and savannas as part of this, climate mitigation initiatives and carbon sequestration initiatives. But interestingly, we still seem to keep doing that. And this is something that actually serves as a form of degradation. It leads to loss of biodiversity. It leads to loss of very key ecosystem services that are provided by these biomes. And in many cases, it doesn't always necessarily lead to greater carbon sequestration. The idea that tropical grassy biomes and savannas don't sequester carbon is not true. There's actually a lot of carbon below ground. It's just that we don't find it above ground. And in some systems, particularly in the northern areas, and I'm not talking about the tropics, I'm talking about temperate systems, when you plant trees in these systems, it can actually lead to a loss of carbon from the system, because trees change albedo, it can increase temperatures, and it can cause loss of soil carbon. So tree planting is not always necessarily a good thing, but it's a threat that faces most of the TGBs across the world and in India also, right? I just want to highlight a couple of other threats to TGBs before I move on. The other major problem facing tropical grassy biomes in India are invasives, both woody plants as well as understory species. So if you look at invasive woody plants, two classic examples are Prosopis juliflora in most of the arid to semi-arid savannas, and Acacia mernsia or black wattle in the more montane grasslands of the Western Ghats. And these are major problems because they have major implications for biodiversity. They impact hydrological cycles, they impact grazing regimes, and so on, right? And TGBs also have a huge problem with invasive species in the understory, lantana being a classic example, but you also have Parthenium, Chromalina, a whole range of other species that are invading the understory. So in this photo on the left, you can see most of that is lantana. It's dried, but and on the right, I don't know if you can see that, but like a lot of the slight pink stuff all across in the background is lantana. And essentially what's happening here is that lantana and other invasive species are replacing the native C4 grasses in the understory. So essentially what's happening in these systems is we are seeing a switch from a C4 to a C3 understory, which means it's likely to fundamentally change the ecology of these systems. Another problem with lantana in these systems is lantana very often tends to climb up along trees. And when you have grasses, the fires don't go that tall. They don't go that high. They don't go into the canopy of trees. It's usually a surface fire. But when it's replaced by lantana, lantana ends up taking the fire into the canopy of the trees, which can increase and result in mortality of the trees actually. So the switch from a C4 grassy understory to a C3 understory dominated by invasives seems to be fundamentally changing the nature of these tropical grassy biomes, right? So that's the status, and we know that these are problems that are going to continue into the future, and we need to find solutions to deal with, things like invasive species, which is not easy. We need to take stock of our tree planting initiatives in grasslands and in savannas. And we need to rethink the role of, or the misconception that grasslands are actually wastelands if we are to successfully manage them in the future. But what about, but there's another major threat faced by TGBs, which is climate change, right? So here are some data that I'm showing you from a study that we did a while ago, where we looked at potential biome shifts in the country under different scenarios of climate change. So on the left is the Olson's vegetation map, broad classification for India, where it shows all these different ecoregions or biomes. And then we used what are called climate niche models. So essentially, it's a very simple model. If we have climate projections for the future, right, then we ask, given that this is what the climate in a particular area is going to be like in the future, what is the vegetation type that it's likely to support based on where we find those biomes currently. So we look at the climate space occupied by these biomes at the current time, and then look to see where that climate, by climate I mean temperature, rainfall, all of that, seasonality, where that climate is going to be present in the future. And based on that, we can say, this is the kind of biome that we're likely to find. Now, this is an approximation because it does not simulate any of the processes, right? So there's no competition, there's no effect of elevated CO2, there's no biological or mechanistic processes. It's purely a correlational. It's purely a correlational approach, but it's a first step. So if we look at this and we projected the potential distribution of biomes in the future for 2070 and 2050 under climate change scenarios. So the RCP 8.5, which is a very aggressive emission scenario, and the RCP 4.5, which is a less aggressive scenario. And essentially what we find is about 630,000 square kilometers, or 18% of the country, is predicted to experience biome shifts into the future. In the future, under the 8.5 scenario, and that comes down to about 486,000 square kilometers under the 4.5 scenario, right? And it's very hard to probably make out from these maps itself because the scale is so small. But the biomes that are likely to be most affected are tropical and subtropical dry forests, savannas, and grasslands, right? So essentially what we see is rainfall is going to increase in many parts, and so the drier areas are going to get wet. So many of the xeric areas are going to switch to arid to semi-arid savannas, and at the wetter end, we're going to start losing savannas because they're going to be replaced by forests, right? And here's another map showing the potential of temperature increases in the future. So essentially we used remotely sensed data and climate projections from multiple models to look at areas in India that are likely to witness greater than 1.5 degree rise in temperature by 2050. And as you can see, if we exclude the Himalayas, a lot of the areas that are going to experience a 1.5 degree increase in mean temperatures are found in the arid and semi-arid savanna systems, right? So, sorry, I just want to make another point here. Interestingly, the increase in many areas seems to be driven by the increasing minimum temperatures rather than maximum temperatures, right? So very often we tend to think of extreme events like, extremely high temperatures and study the effects of extremely high temperatures on vegetation communities and so on. But less attention has been given to the effects of increasing minimum temperatures. And in many of these cases, at least of these regions in India, the increases in average temperatures are driven more by increasing minimum temperatures rather than maximum temperatures. And I'm going to use that as the transition point to move to one specific study system that we've been working on a lot, and it's something that many of you may be familiar with, which is the case of the montane Shola-grassland forest mosaics, right? So we know that the upper reaches of the Western Ghats have these unique Shola-grassland forest grassland mosaics, which we call Shola-grassland mosaics, where you have stunted evergreen forests interspersed as patches within a grassland matrix. And so this is a photograph from the Upper Nilgiris, and there's been a lot of work done in the Upper Nilgiris by many other people, including Professor Sukumar from IISc and his group. And essentially what they've done here is they've reconstructed the paleohistory of the Shola-grassland mosaics. And what this map here shows is based on isotopes. On the y-axis on the right, it says the proportion of C4 plants. That is the proportion of grasses in the system from 40,000 years before present to now. And as you can see, the proportion of C4 grasses is varied between about 45% to 75%. So both grasslands and forests, so these mosaics, have actually coexisted for more than 40,000 years. Right? They've been present for a long time. They're a fairly ancient system. And the question becomes, how are these systems going to respond to climate change? So before I get into that, I'm just going to talk briefly about the history of the Upper Nilgiris, which also serves as a case study in how these systems have been mismanaged because of the perception, that they're degraded ecosystems. So this is work done by a student of mine, Atul Joshi, and ex-student of mine, I should say. And what he did was he spent some time in the India office of the British Library going through, the records and correspondence of old foresters from the region. And he was able to unearth a couple of drawings, actually. And so this is a drawing of Ooty in the mid 1850s, right? In the 1850s. And as you can see from the drawing, essentially it was a Shola-grassland mosaic, right? And this lake you can see here, that's supposed to be Ooty Lake. Most of it is covered by grasslands. Here's another drawing of a church. If you go to Ooty now, this church still stands. And as you can see, all around it is grassland. There are a few Shola patches, but this is predominantly a Shola-grassland system. Now, the problem is most of the early colonial foresters viewed this as a degraded ecosystem. So essentially, they thought that the indigenous people, that's the Todas here, had degraded this land so much that a lot of the forests were lost and had been converted into grasslands, and they felt the need to actually manage it and restore it in such a way that they brought trees back into the system. Right, and they started planting trees, and this is that church again photo. And by the mid 20th century, you can see the landscape has already been converted with a lot of trees. And in fact, they planted over 40 different exotic species, over a period of many years. Most of them didn't take. Some of them survived, but did not become invasive. But one species in particular, Acacia mearnsii, black wattle, became invasive in the landscape. Interestingly, the British recognized this early on. So very soon after they planted it, they realized that it was going rogue and getting across the landscape. But we just still have not been able to control this plant, this tree. And if you look at it right now, this is in the upper reaches of the Nilgiris. I don't know if you can see this, but this bright green patch is a Shola patch, and everything else around is wattle, what was once grassland, but it is now invaded by wattle, right? And so a lot of these Shola-grassland, a lot of the extent of the Shola-grassland has already been lost to this invasive species. There are other invasive species like gorse and Scotch broom that are already there, but wattle is a huge problem, right? And so the question that Atul asked is, what is going to be the fate of the remaining grasslands? We know climate is changing, and it's going to change in the future. What is going to happen to these remaining grasslands? Are they going to be invaded more or less? And is the extent of invasion or establishment by trees likely to be different for native Shola trees versus invasive species? Essentially, what he did was he did an experiment to look at how warmer temperatures are going to affect tree establishment in grasslands. We know from past work that many, from Atul's own work, that frost seems to be a major limiting factor, or in this case, in the case of the Nilgiris, it is the primary limiting factor that limits native trees from establishing in the grasslands. So they are able to germinate, They establish, but when winter comes and you have frosts, the frosts kill the native Shola trees. It doesn't have, whereas the exotic species or acacia is able to tolerate frost to a certain extent. So essentially what he looked was, what are the effects of warmer temperatures going to be on tree establishment in the system? So what we did was we collected seeds from the field, we brought them back, germinated them in a greenhouse, and then we transported them back to the field, and then we transplanted them into polybags. We let them acclimatize for a while, and then we began the experiment, or Atul began the experiment. So essentially he had two treatments. So he transported this back to the field and kept these plants flush with the ground in these polybags, where each polybag contains a seedling of one species. And we had a total of 6 species, like I said. And there were 2 treatments. Some of these were warmed at night and the others were not. And it was replicated and all that good stuff, right? And so how did he do the warming? He actually used these thermal blankets strapped onto these boards, and he used to place this over these seedlings every night. And essentially what these thermal blankets did was they trapped the heat. And so it warmed these plots relative to the control plots. And this is a huge amount of work, because every evening you had to go, put on these thermal blankets and come up early in the morning and take them out. And this went on through the whole winter. And we also measured temperatures in these plots. And this is what the temperature graph looks like from November to February. The blue line is the control plots. So the ones that were open. And the red lines are the ones in the warm plots, where these thermal blankets were put on at night, or nighttime warming plots. And as you can see, the experimental treatment worked. Temperatures in the nighttime warming treatments were significantly higher than in the control plots. And in most cases, they were above 0. So the temperatures didn't go below 0, except for 2 cases. In one case, we were not able to get there in time to put the thermal blankets on. And in the other case, they were actually blown off because of high winds. And only on 2 days, actually, temperatures in the nighttime warming treatment dropped below 0. Whereas in the control treatment, it dropped below 0 15 times over the course of the experiment. And sub-zero temperatures very often are associated with frost, and these are just photos of frost from the study site. And this, as we know, can have significant negative effects on plant growth and survival, right? So what do the results look like? So on the left panel, it shows survival probability of native species and invasive species in the control treatment. So where there was no nighttime warming. And on the right, we show survival again over the course of the winter when the plots have been warmed. So let's focus on the panel on the left in the control treatment. The line in blue is shows the survival probability of native species. And these little dots actually at the bottom represent frost events. As we can see, from December to, by the end of January, most of the native seedlings have actually died. So survival gets pretty close to 0. Wattle, on the other hand, about 30 to 40% of wattle seedlings survived the whole winter under controlled conditions. What happens under warming? Under warming, actually, what we see is there's a significant increase in the survival of the native trees. So the native trees are able to persist and establish in these grasslands, at least past the seedling stage for one winter, and about 40% of them survive. But if we look at wattle, under a warming climate, is actually about 90% of wattle seedlings survived, right? So there's significantly greater survival when protected from freezing temperatures, and overwintering survival of invasives was nearly 90% under warmer conditions. So what does this say about the future of the Shola grasslands in a warmer world? Well, we know that low nighttime temperatures and frost impose a strong demographic bottleneck, limiting native species establishment in these high elevation Shola grasslands. The processes might be different at lower elevations, but we know at least in these higher elevation systems like the Upper Nilgiris and maybe even in Eraviculam, I'm not sure, I haven't worked there, but it's likely to be frost that's limiting trees from establishing in these systems. And future warming is likely to favor tree establishment. So both native trees as well as the invasive what will do better when under a warmer world. But warming is likely to facilitate the invasives to a much greater extent than native species and is likely to result in greater invasion of Acacia mearnsii into the remaining grasslands. Right? So it's climate change in particular, warming in particular, is likely to be a major threat to the existence of this iconic biome, which is already, we've already lost a lot of it, both to invasives and to other land use changes. So, we really need to find ways to actually protect these iconic ecosystems. So I think I've come to the end of my time. So I'm just going to quickly wrap up, and then I'm happy to take questions. So just to recap, tropical grasslands and savannas are ancient biomes. We know they evolved we believe they evolved about 5 to 8 million years ago. They support unique biodiversity. They have a lot of endemic species. They're home to most of the large herbivores and carnivores. And some savanna ecosystems like the Cerrados in Brazil are actually biodiversity hotspot. Even they actually support very high levels of biodiversity. There have been issues with nomenclature and their classification and perceptions that they're degraded ecosystems. And this has led to their historical mismanagement in many ways. I'll just talk about that in a second. Large tracts of these have already been converted to other land uses in India, and the remaining TGBs continue to be threatened by a range of factors, including land conversion, tree planting for carbon sequestration and forestry activities, changes in fire and grazing regimes in many areas. There's a concerted effort to suppress fire, which may not be necessarily a good management strategy. And invasion by exotic species is another major threat to this. And global changes, including changes in rainfall, temperature, nutrient deposition, and elevated CO2, are likely to pose major threats to these biomes. I only talked about one of those, temperature, a little bit about rainfall, based on the climate model that I showed you. But there are other factors like nutrient deposition, nitrogen and phosphorus, and elevated CO2, which are also considered major threats to these biomes. I haven't talked about it here, but there's been a lot of work to show that elevated CO2, for example, is likely to favor C3 plants over C4 grasses, and so that's likely to result in a thickening of these biomes. Yeah. With that, I will stop and acknowledge a lot of people. Dr. Jayashree Ratnam, Dr. Atul Joshi, Dr. Abhi Vanak, Kalyan Verma for all the photos, my students, past and present, NCBS TIFR for funding, the Tamil Nadu Forest Department for permits for us to work, MOES and DST for funds. And with that, I will stop, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, sir. That was a wonderful presentation. At the same time, we have streaming your video on YouTube and Facebook. We have got a few questions. First one.
Yeah.
When a dry, moist, or dry deciduous forest can be treated as a savanna? You said that there is a complication in classification in Indian system. So when we have to consider a dry or a moist deciduous forest as a savanna?
Yeah. So the key here is the presence of C4 grasses in the understory. Now, systems that have the interesting thing about this is if you actually look at the trees, right? The trees seem to walk across this boundary. So you'll see the same trees. I mean, if you look at the Combretaceae, Terminalia, Anogaceae and stuff, you'll see them in areas where you have grasses in the understory. And you'll also see them in more dense areas where the grasses have dropped off, right? So it is actually just the presence of the grasses in the understory that defines the ecology of these systems. And that is what we should use to differentiate mesic savannas from dry deciduous forests. We don't know where that transition is. People have looked at it in South America, for example, and found out under what leaf area index or at what level of shadiness the grasses drop off. But we don't have similar studies in India to identify exactly where it drops off. And the other serious problem is right now, many of these areas have been invaded by C3 species already. So it's kind of hard to just look at it right now and know whether, those C3, whether those invasive species replaced herbs or they replaced grasses, right? So it's a bit of a problem to be able to actually accurately define where this transition is from deciduous forest to savanna. And like I said, not all deciduous forests are savannas. It's just the ones that have grasses in the understory that operate differently. I don't know if that answers the question, but
Thank you, sir. Second question. Uh, the relationship between water and the grassy biomes. How the grassy biomes respond to the water availability, if water is higher or water is lower, and kind of functional changes should be take place in that grassy biomes.
right. So yeah, so water is a very key driver, obviously, in most of the arid and semi-arid savannas, and many of these are defined, but they have extended periods of water stress, right? So savannas, like 6 to 8 months of there is serious water stress, and so the plants are adapted to it, and so changes in water availability are likely to change the functioning of these biomes. If there's increases in water, it's likely to have certain effects, but decreases in water or droughts are also predicted to have significant impacts on these systems. So in the past, people thought, because there is such high intra and interannual variability in rainfall, many savanna ecosystems may actually be very resilient to drought. But there are examples from the world over. There have been recent droughts in South Africa and Australia and so on, suggesting that droughts can actually have, can impose significant mortality on the trees. So water availability is a key factor. And if we look within these grasslands and savannas, as you move from the drier to wetter savannas or grasslands, the functional traits of the grasses themselves change. So if you look at the dry savannas, the grasses tend to be actually nutrient. They tend to be high nutrients. They tend to be nutrient rich, and they support a lot of herbivore biomass. Whereas as it gets wetter and wetter, the grasses, you tend to find taller grasses, and these taller grasses are competing for light. They're, in the Western Ghats, for example, it'll be a lot of temeda or tall grasses like Cymbopogon, and they're poor quality for herbivores, right? So as water availability increases, the suitability for herbivores decrease, and you don't find too many large mammalian herbivores in these wetter tall grass savannas just because the forage is pretty poor. Most of them tend to be concentrated in the drier savannas where forage availability is low, but nutrient quality is high. So the drier savannas tend to be driven more by herbivores, and the wetter savannas tend to be driven more by fires, where fire acts as a general herbivore. It just consumes all of that biomass periodically. Yeah. Does that answer the question? Sorry, you're on mute. I think I can't hear you. Yeah.
Sir, are you believing that concept of invasive species, or this is how evolution works?
That's a tricky one. A philosophical argument, but I'm not sure that this is how evolution works. I know that biomes get reorganized that way, and people argue that every species was invasive at some point in time, or at least exotic. But I mean, that philosophical argument aside, I think it is a huge problem right now, and I don't know how or whether it is even possible to control, say, species like lantana or prosopis, given the scale of the invasion across the country. But what we know is, it can lead to formation of these novel biomes. It's reorganizing the biome structure so much that we may have to fundamentally rethink these biomes, just because the presence of these invasive species has changed the fundamental dynamics of the system so much. And if we are not able to get rid of it, then maybe at some point we may have to accept it. I don't know. I think that's a choice that every person has to make. But it seems to me like other than biocontrol, I don't know what will actually work at this scale, because we cannot go and uproot every lantana plant across the country or prosopis across the country. So it really needs creative ways to actually control it. But yeah, you're right. It is changing the system in fundamental ways. So I don't know if I've answered the question, but that's a tricky one. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. One of our fellow asked the same questions. He's mentioning he's staying in a scrub forest, his area near scrub forest, and asked some control method for Prosopis, Lantana, Hippis, and Senna. You already said that there is some biocontrol methods, but
I
for
don't know if there are biocontrol methods yet when tested, because there are also issues with biocontrol, right? In our country, we haven't, at least to my knowledge, used biocontrol to a very large extent. But so, for example, Ayesha Prasad has done a lot of work on lantana, and it has to be uprooted, and you have to keep de-weeding it continuously for a long time before the seed bank is depleted. But such things you can only do at a small scale, right? Because you cannot clear. There's always going to be a source pool of lantana around you, so you can clear it from a small patch, that you work in. But at larger scales, there's always the threat of recolonization. So that's why I said I'm not sure to what extent these small-scale methods might actually work. It's a pretty challenging problem, and we need to find creative ways to actually deal with it. So, in answer to the, I don't know for Senna and all of these whether people have studied it and found whether different techniques work. Right? In some cases, fire works as a management tool. In other cases, it does not. So, at least in the Nilgiris, when people have looked at the response of different invasive plants, shrubs, some of them fires actually suppress them, whereas it favors the other ones. So when you have multiple invasive species in a plot where some are favored by fires, others are not favored by fires, it's hard to use fire as a management tool, right? Because you're going to suppress some but favor the others. So these are tricky issues, and restoration of these systems is a challenge. Yeah. You're muted again. Sorry. Yeah.
different published papers have a contrasting view on Pteridium aquilunum, which is a eagle fern, and some mention it as a weed, whereas others mention them as invasive. So, what is your take on this matter?
I am sorry, I don't know much about this species, so I really cannot comment on it. Yeah, I mean, I think weed and uh, invasive. So, weed is a term that's used rather colloquially in many instances. A lot of the invasives are weed, a lot of non invasives are also classified as weeds. I think it just represents, you know, a rural growth strategy where they tend to thrive in disturbances, and they have produce a lot of seeds, fast growth rates, and so on. And many invasive species share those same traits. And so, yeah, as far as I know, or the term weed is used rather generally and colloquially. So, and given that I don't know much about this species, I really can't say whether it's invasive or not. Sorry.
So, another question. There is some pteridine ferns which can seen in montane grasslands, and it replaces the grasses as its invasive capabilities. And can you comment on this?
Yeah, so a lot of the ferns, at least to my knowledge, some of them are promoted by fires, at least the ones that I've looked at. So we've actually tried to dig up some of these, the root systems and, it's in many cases, a lot of them are the same individual. They're just clones coming out from, common rootstock, from common below ground parts. So in those cases, it's actually fire that seems to be spreading or helping the spread of those ferns. I don't know about all ferns. And I'm not a taxonomist, and I'm not very good at identifying ferns either. But I can tell you that we've seen fire as a dominant driver of the expansion of some of these species, at least in grasslands. Yeah.
You have answered one question regarding this, how to consider a savanna and differentiate between a savanna and a moist deciduous forest. There is a. I will reread the questions once more.
Mm-hmm.
The question is like, how do we draw the limit between this dry or moist deciduous forest and grassy biomes or savanna?
Sorry, I thought I answered this, but so like I said, the only defining feature seems to be the existence of the grassy understory, right? If you have grasses in the understory, it tends to be is what we call savanna. Now, there's a problem is that if you take a deciduous forest or a moist forest that didn't have grasses in the understory, you cut the trees and you disturbed it, then also you tend to have grasses in the understory. So differentiating it becomes a little tricky, like I said, just because in some cases it may be a result of degradation, in other cases it is not. And if you look across different continents, interestingly, these boundaries are not fixed across different continents. So if you look at Africa, where this transition from savanna to forest occurs, or you look at South America, or you look at Australia, they all tend to happen at different, let's say, rainfall levels, right? So in Africa, it happens somewhere around 700 millimeters of rainfall. In Australia, it happens at a much higher level, and South America is much wetter. And the reason for this is, like I said, when these biomes were formed 5 to 8 million years ago, and there was this global expansion of C4 grasses, the continents had already split. And so the savannas on the different continents have evolved independently. So even though they are structurally very similar, they're functionally very different because of this independent evolution of savannas on different biomes, right? And unfortunately, there aren't too many studies here, at least that I am aware of, to show exactly where that transition occurs. So it is a bit of a problem. It is a bit of a challenge, and we'll have to use other kinds of proxies rather than maybe necessarily current days, because, and I also said in many of these cases in the last 20 to 30 years, the grasses have been replaced by invasive species. So just by looking at it, it really doesn't tell us, whether they're anthropogenic savannas or whether they're climatically determined savannas. Across the gradient, otherwise, one proxy that people have used is to look at the fire traits of the trees. So if the trees are fire adapted, right, then it's likely that in the past, this is a system that has been exposed to a lot of fires. So people have looked at the traits of the trees and look at the fire adapted traits of the trees. And if you do tend to see trees with fire adaptations, then it's likely that at least it may have been a savanna in the past. Does that clarify matters a bit?
Okay, thank you, sir. So we have to wind up.
Okay.
That was a wonderful presentation and question and answer section. Thank you, sir. And here I thank all the participants and who asked the questions. And once again, thank you from the behalf of AKRSA KFRI. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. You're very welcome. It was a pleasure to do this. And I, hope everybody is keeping safe and will keep safe. Yeah, thank you again for inviting me.
Thanks.
Yeah. So sign off then.